So when Nancy sent me the word and said, this is posted on the web, this was the title that was there, and I don't remember if I gave you that title or not.
I think we were throwing it around as a
feature. Yeah. Now, if I were you and I saw that title attached to a talk that I was going to give, I would be thinking, this is going to be rich. Because if you know me, you know that I'm actually not qualified to talk about that. But I actually think it's a really important issue. And so instead of that title for this talk, I want to use this title. And I want to talk about what I think of as the context for this larger frame, which is looking forward to a new era of librarianship. And I want to, first of all, start off by acknowledging that a lot of what I'm talking about here is was gained in my process of being a student of Margaret Hedstrom. Margaret and I wrote a paper back in 2004, 2003, 2004 called On the Lam, Library, Archive, and Museum Collections and the Creation and Maintenance of Knowledge Communities. This was a paper that was written at the request of the OECD and was subsequently published by the OECD. There's a web, just email me if you want the website, jlking@umich.edu. And I can give you the pointer. But if you want to go look at the paper, there's a background paper on the subject. But I wanted to say that a lot of what's in this talk is framed by that paper. My core theme today, this is what I'm going to keep coming back to, is the relationship between these three concepts: infrastructure, access, and agency. And my main shot is going to be the following. So I'm going to reinforce this as I go through this talk, but I want to give it to you now. Changing infrastructure alters the access that people have to resources. And in altering that access, it changes their agency. It changes their ability to act, changes their power in relationship to each other and in relationship to the larger world. And as you can see as we go through this, we are experiencing enormous changes in infrastructure. Now, infrastructure has a number of interesting features, one of which is that it's invisible until it breaks. Right? It's so deeply embedded, it's so out of sight. Often it is literally embedded under the earth. You can see over by the Hatcher Library some of that going on right now. The tunnel and the other infrastructure is literally being buried. As soon as that's covered, the vast majority of people in the university won't even know it's there. Right? So the fact that infrastructure is invisible means that the people who work in the infrastructural world and who support the infrastructural world are themselves somewhat invisible. And I would argue that one of the functions of the library, and let's just make it clear that most of what I'm talking about here is academic libraries, most of that enterprise is, at least in the minds of a lot of the people in the university, invisible. It's a kind of infrastructure. Now, not too long ago, there was a guy named Nicholas Carr who published a paper in Harvard Business Review called IT Doesn't Matter. And this was an opportune moment, and he's now making a lot of money as a consultant and so forth. And if you read the article, what he says is, once things become infrastructural, they no longer matter. Now, that's an interesting comment. And he was actually using a very narrow slice about business strategy and the relationship between strategy and infrastructure. But I would say that Carr got it wrong right at the beginning. Only the most important things in our world ever make it to infrastructure status. And the simplest metric you can use to figure that out is look at how much we spend on infrastructure. There's various estimates about this, but if you think of infrastructure as not only the hard infrastructure, but the social infrastructure that's necessary to keep it alive, keep it going, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of GDP goes into infrastructure. And unlike other things that are made up of GDP, this one is not discretionary. We invest in infrastructure every year, year after year after year, because we can't not do that. We have to do that. Now, Michigan, for example, looks as though it invests somewhat less in infrastructure like roads than 49 other states. I came from California. They're investing less now, too, and their roads are starting to look more like Michigan. But you notice it every time you drive on, say, the eastern end of West Huron River Drive. What happens when you ignore infrastructure? Things fall apart. And they're things that you really need. They're important to you. They're not discretionary things. So this is a talk about changing infrastructure and how access and agency changes. And I want to put it in the context of the university. Now, the university is a pretty old institution. There was a some kind of university. We don't have very much of a record about it at a place called Takshashila in India about 2,700 years ago. It's probably the oldest thing that was actually organized in a way that we would think of as a university in the world, or at least one we have a record of, but we don't have much of a record. The more contemporary university is about 1,000 years old. The longest living example of that is at Al-Azhar in Cairo. The ones that we think of more commonly are institutions like Bologna, which is around 900 years old, or Oxford, which is around 800 years old. University of Michigan, in contrast, if you believe the 1817 start date, is 190 years old in round numbers. So we're a relatively recent instance of a very old thing. And there's a very interesting history tied to that old thing. And it goes back to classical antiquity. This is an artist's rendition of the library at Alexandria. The library at Alexandria, you're all aware, was one of the premier libraries of classical antiquity. It wasn't the only one. There were others at Pergamon and so forth. But this library was an effort to pull together all of the materials in Greek from that period. This was the sort of Hellenistic period of Egypt. And it was a fairly successful endeavor. It was probably the largest collection that had ever been assembled, and it was fairly systematically maintained and so forth. And as we know, it was destroyed. The library was burned, and what was left of the collection was dissipated. Now, this period also contains a really interesting quote by Timon Philius in his Athenaeus, which I think is the first ever quote about the faculty. I always like that quote. This is about the library in Alexandria. So, you know, the idea that the library was a place where people gathered together and talked about things, argued about things, is essentially the idea of a knowledge community. Right? That people came together around the collections. That's the key thing. The collections were sort of the magnet that pulled them together, and they got themselves engaged in intellectual discourse and tried to make sense out of the world. Now, out of this classical antiquity period came the sort of golden age of Greek thinking, the creation of the Trivium and the Quadrivium. These were the two core components of a classical education, at least from antiquity. And what I want to say here is that an interesting thing happened when the library at Alexandria and other collections like that were dissipated. The collections survived in a fragmentary way, but there was actually a pattern to their survival. And the really interesting pattern for the West, because those of you who know this history know that the more complete corpus of the Hellenistic Enlightenment was actually saved in the Islamic world. It was not saved in the West. The fragments that made it through to the West and that survived during the period from around 400 to the 11th century were what was left of the writings that form the core of the pedagogical construct of the Trivium and the Quadrivium. And what was sort of systematically left out of that was the Trivium. The components of mathematics, for example, did not make it into the West. The key elements of astronomy did not make it into the West. And this is the reason why the humanistic tradition in the West, the letters and so forth, is not mathematical. Whereas in the classical sphere, mathematics was actually at the heart of the whole enterprise. There's a story that over the gate to Plato's Academy in Athens was the slogan, no person who does not understand geometry enters this gate. Right? This goes back to the Pythagorean tradition. Right? So this is just one small instance of how an interruption in the collection process has a fundamental effect on what happens subsequently in knowledge communities. And so the absence of mathematics from what we think of as the liberal sciences, the liberal arts, and that still carries through today, that echoes in the current world, was due to the fact that the collections just didn't survive intact. They were uneven. Now, the Islamic corpus, the surviving corpus that made it from the Hellenistic period through to the West in the 11th and 12th century, came via Toledo primarily. Toledo in the Umayyad dynasty, which was the Moorish invasion of Iberia from North Africa, after the fall of the Visigoth Empire, was what happened to Toledo was that Toledo was actually the Visigoth center of learning too. This was the place where the Visigoth Code of Law, which was important in the development of subsequent Western jurisprudence, was created. And there were a lot of intelligent people. It was a knowledge community who were living in Toledo. And when the Umayyad dynasty spread to the rise of the Islamic world and located its primary center of Islamic learning in Iberia in Toledo, it built a great library. And the library at Toledo was one of the largest libraries of the Islamic world. Now, when the end of the Moorish Empire fell to the Christian forces of Northern Europe in the 11th century, at the end of the 11th century, the library and all of the production systems, the knowledge communities were taken intact. They were not destroyed. And over the next several hundred years, that corpus was all translated into Latin. And those documents began to circulate throughout the West. And they made the foundation of what we think of as the Italian Renaissance, which happened in the 14th century. And they led directly to the rise of the modern university. Now, that's a very long story that I'm not going to go into. But I just want to use this to punctuate my point that these collections are a kind of infrastructure. They're a very essential kind of infrastructure. They have a dramatic effect on what people are empowered to do. And the unevenness of that transmission of that infrastructure, the unevenness by which the libraries of classical antiquity were carried forward into the West, had a hugely disruptive influence. You can imagine that if those collections had not been destroyed, the history of the West would have been very different than it is. But there was a very long period of time, about 500, 700 years, where key pieces of that were simply missing from the West, and it's a period that we call, interestingly, the Dark Ages. Now, there wasn't a complete absence of intellectual activity during that period. There was a lot going on, actually, and in every generation there are smart people born. So there was stuff going on, but they didn't have the tools that they could have had that were actually extant in the world elsewhere during that period. Now, the next key focus on infrastructure is printing, which came in the 15th century. The story I want to tell about printing here is a story about access and agency. The real impact of the printing press in the period of from about the 15th to the 17th century in Europe was in the Reformation. Martin Luther was a contemporary of the creation of the printing press. And it's interesting, if you might remember that Martin Luther's primary immediate concern, the thing that really triggered him to go way out on a limb and nail his 96 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral, was the selling of indulgences. Basically what he was concerned about was what subsequently became an insight from the Enlightenment, that power corrupts people. And what happened was the church hierarchy, because of their tremendous hold of power over the people, had become highly corrupt. And the hierarchy was using its power to grant or deny salvation, frankly, to enrich itself. Johannes Gutenberg's first paid commission was printing letters of indulgence for the Archbishop of Mainz. Right? So this story, it starts right at the beginning. The first paid job that Gutenberg got for his press was not the Bible, not printing the Bible. It was printing these letters of indulgence. So you can see that right from the very get-go, this concept of the infrastructure of printing, the ability to get this information out in a way that was far more cost-effective than had ever been possible, was intimately connected to the rising turmoil in the church. Now, what Luther wanted to do fundamentally was a concept of disintermediation and reintermediation. You might remember that Luther's great line was, "Every man his own priest." And so his concern was that the control that the church hierarchy had over access to salvation was not only corrupting, but it was actually blasphemous, that it was an affront to God, and in particular to the teachings of Jesus. And what Luther wanted to do was disintermediate the clergy in the process of salvation. Now, that's a hard thing to do when the church owns all of the means of production. So, for example, in an illiterate society where you're trying to educate people about the fundamental concepts of the faith, it's really handy to have a slideshow like PowerPoint to educate them. And of course, these were the stained glass windows of the cathedrals, right, in the churches. You'd take these people inside. You had, it was backlit during the day. You'd take them inside and say, okay, this is the story. This is how you believe. These are the lessons that you're supposed to learn. And it's a very, very powerful kind of education and reinforcement. How do you get people who are not literate, who don't have any access to understanding this, except that they be taught by the church hierarchy, away from the church hierarchy, but still somehow on the path to salvation? Well, one way you could do it is give them the scriptures directly. But that requires two things: a whole bunch of scriptures and the ability to read. They're complementary assets in this production scheme. And that's precisely what the Protestant Reformation set about to do. So the Protestants were the first in the Christendom world to require that all of their clergy be literate. If you were a Roman Catholic priest in the 15th century, you didn't have to be literate. In fact, most of the Roman Catholic priests couldn't read. That tradition was started in response to the fact that the Protestants in Northern Europe were gaining the upper hand. So it was at the Council of Trent in the middle of the 16th century where the Catholic Church finally decided all priests have to know how to read, because they were getting their tails kicked by the Protestants. It turned out that this was a real advantage, to know how to read and to know how to be able to teach other people to read, and then to give them the scripture was an enormously empowering advantage on the side of the Protestants. Now, of course, we also know that the rise of Protestantism was the rise of schism in Christian faiths. So that's the danger. You put access and agency into the hands of the individuals, they start acting as though they're free. And pretty soon they start thinking, well, actually the way I read this is not the way you read this, and for that reason I have to kill you. Right? And then so there was this long period of religious strife, not just between the Protestant world, the Lutherans essentially, and the world of Roman Catholicism, but of course it's splintered into hundreds of sects. And a lot of the migration of people from Western Europe to the United States was around this religious strife. A great many people who immigrated to the colonies were doing it to escape these kinds of religious wars. And the concept of religious freedom in the United States was sort of grounded in that. So this is a kind of infrastructure that changes access and as a result changes agency. It changes people's ability to do things, to be empowered. Now there's another story along these lines which comes back to collecting. This is part of this paper that Margaret and I wrote that I worked on in particular. I got interested in museums. And there was a guy named John Tredescant who was a 15th century, late 15th, early 16th century, who was a collector. He was a gardener, actually. He was a botanical expert, just as a layperson, if you will. And he was a gardener to some of the royal family in the UK, or England at the time. And he started collecting things. And he was very well connected into the Admiralty. And of course, this was the age of exploration, right? Columbus had gone over in the end of the 15th century and then opened up the New World. And so a lot of stuff was coming back to Europe from the New World, stuff that people had never seen before. And Tredescant asked the captains of the ships of the British Navy to bring him back anything strange. And it turns out there's a lot of strange stuff that they were finding. And so this stuff somehow made it back, not all of it, but a lot of it made it back into Tredescant's hands. And he created an enterprise in London, in Lambeth, South Lambeth, called the Ark. And it was a place where he showed his rarities, Tredescant's rarities. And it was actually an entertainment. He charged people admission to see this thing. Now, some of the people who came to see it realized there was actually more value to it than just the price of admission. There was actually a very interesting treatise written about this by one of the visitors who said that what's happening in this thing is going to transform education. This is going to have a fundamental effect on education. So this is a very early insight about the power of collecting in education. But the key player in the story was a guy named Elias Ashmole. He was a much more educated person than Tredescant. He had a lot of ties to Oxford University. And he went to Tredescant at one point and said, you know, it would be very useful since this concept of collecting had taken on a kind of a fad behavior among the aristocrats of Europe, and the royal courts would start creating their own, what were called cabinets of curiosity, or Wunderkammern, there was a contest going on. Who could have the biggest and most complete and exciting one of these cabinets of curiosities? And because this had been spreading around the royal courts of Europe, and there were several large ones in Sweden and Denmark and Germany and so forth, Ashmole came and said, you know what would really be useful is if we could create a catalog of your collection, and maybe even illustrate the catalog, make drawings of the things that you have, because then people would be able to see what you have without having to come to the museum. That would be really handy. So he and a colleague cataloged everything in Tredescan's collection and published it as a document called the Museum Tredescantianum. And this began to circulate around Europe. It was printed and distributed and circulated. And all of the other cabinets of curiosity owners decided, geez, that's a good idea. I'm gonna do that too. And they started publishing catalogs, and those catalogs started circulating. And this was the beginning of scientific publication. Right? This was a means by which people who were interested in more than just look at all the cool things I have, but were interested in what it meant. And a lot of this took place around mollusk shells, seashells, because they're durable items. They last a long time. So the collections can be very complete. And people started doing comparative research. You know, is this shell that I have the same shell that person has? If not, you know, what explains the difference? Are they two different constructs? It was actually the circulation of these catalogs that Carl von Linné used to create the Linnaean system of standardized nomenclature for flora and fauna, right? The one we now use, the two-part Latin official name for living things, was built directly out of this process. So here again is a case in which the infrastructure was pretty profoundly changed by the fact that some bright people got together and said, if we put this thing together with that thing, and we created this new kind of capability, this would allow a lot more people to get at the thing that we're interested in, and that would empower them to make contributions and to participate in this story. Well, of course, it wasn't very far from that to a pretty substantial increase in attention to systematic collecting of writing. And you're probably familiar with Thomas Bodley, who was a member of the Oxford community, who made a deal with the Stationers Guild of London, which was essentially the printing apparatus of the British Empire. And the deal he made with them was, every time you print something, we want a copy of it that we're going to keep here at Oxford. And that way, somebody will have a copy of everything you do, namely us, and people can come and use those copies and compare the copies and compare the different works. And of course, this eventually became the Bodleian Library at Oxford. So this idea that you systematically collect things because it's the collection of these things that creates these knowledge communities, even if that's not your original intent. Tredescan never thought that he was going to create a knowledge community. He thought he was just collecting cool stuff. But it was the efforts, the intervention of Ashmole, and by the way, the Tredescan collection became the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, which was the first scientific museum for research purposes in the world. That these people were building a kind of capability to generate communities of knowledge. Now, you fast forward to today. I'm going to use this little chart that was created by a guy named Jamie Fries at Stanford for a completely different purpose than this. But I want to use this to show sort of what difference this makes. This is a chart called the rectangularization of mortality. And this is basically the number of survivors of 100,000 people born alive. And this is that data for the United States alone. But use the United States as a proxy for the developed world. So this is the age down here up to age 85. And this is the 100,000 people born alive. And the curve represents essentially the die-off rate. Right? So if you look here, this lower curve here is 1900. That's the baseline. And you start here with 100,000 born alive, and you have a very sharp infant and child mortality up to age 5. And so an awful lot of people die. About 20% of the population dies during this period. And then this curve, as you see, is almost like the hypotenuse of a triangle. You could do a regression to be pretty close to that. And what happened basically was if you survived to age 5, then the population sort of just trickled off until everybody was pretty much dead down here. The average age at death was in the 40s in 1900 in the United States. So people like me, way past the mean, living on borrowed time. This is the curve for 1930. This is the curve for 1960. This was published in 1981, and this is an estimate for 1996, but in fact the 1996 curve is actually a little sharper than this. And as you can see, the curve is bulging out toward the upper right-hand corner, and this is the concept of the rectangularization. Now the upshot of this is that there's longer lifespan, and of course all of those additional years are tacked onto the end, at the beginning. So that means people have longer work lives. During the 20th century, the number of years that people were able to work doubled. Lifespan increased by 50%, and the number of years you were able to work doubled. This had enormous impacts on the productivity of the society. Many more years could be spent learning, and more wealth, far more wealth was generated as a result of this. So this was a huge payoff. And, people were actually, by this point, starting to catch on to how important this was. And they were starting to make social investments in the capability to do this kind of thing at scale. Among other things they did was they created universities, like ours. And that was a phenomenon that really got rolling about 200 years ago. I mean, people sort of woke up and realized, and it's not surprisingly, it was during the Industrial Revolution when people began to see that knowledge allows you to harness the heat gradient, for example, to get additional power. It allowed you to do things, create implements, tools that gave you enormous advantage. And it became obvious that it was a good idea to start investing the surplus of the society in the means to do more of this. And institutions like the University of Michigan and University of Michigan football grew out of this very quickly. Now, we are not a land-grant institution, technically, although, in fact, some of our early money did come from land grants in the form of the salt springs, but I won't go into that. But the idea that this was in the interest of the society as a whole kind of grabbed a hold, and Justin Morrill, in the latter part of the 19th century, wrote something called the Morrill Act. He tried to get it passed a number of times. Finally did get it passed in 1863. It was signed into law by Abraham Lincoln. This was the Landgrant Colleges and Universities Act. So the whole idea of the Landgrant College took hold. Just to give you an idea of how powerful this thing is, we're not the land-grant institution in the state. Michigan State is our land-grant institution. Michigan State owns property in every county in the state of Michigan, every single county. Michigan State owns property. They have a presence, and initially it was just because of agricultural extension. But this is true throughout the United States. So there is a presence of the U.S. higher education apparatus in every single county in the United States, in one form or another. This is how fine-grained and how big this thing finally became. And of course, when the GI Bill of Rights, or technically the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, came into being, this created the model that we're used to now, which was basically the following. If you have what it takes to succeed in getting a higher education, tertiary education, you should do it, and the society will try to make that possible for you. And it will do it in two ways. One, it'll provide the institutions to make that happen, the centers of production. And it will provide some means for you to get yourself to that place and hang out there. Join that knowledge community and be part of that production scheme and benefit yourself and the society in that process. Now, this was not limited to universities. This was a generalized social movement. Now, in the upper left-hand corner is Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was arguably the first billionaire in the United States. When he sold Carnegie Steel to Jay Gould, he sold it for about $1 billion. And Carnegie was certainly probably the third richest person in the history of the United States. Bill Gates is fourth or fifth. John Rockefeller was number one. Carnegie gave away an enormous amount of money. He gave away enough money just in his library commission. That's not the only commission he created. So Carnegie Commission in higher education too. But in his library commission, he gave away enough money to build 2,800 libraries. One of them in the lower left-hand corner you might recognize. It's actually still there, at least the part that's in the picture. It's the remnant over on the side of the Frieze building. That was actually a Carnegie library. Back in that time, the school districts in the state of Michigan ran the public libraries, and so the Carnegie Library is actually, it's not a special building. The Frieze and the Carnegie Library are the same building. But the Carnegie Commission, because of the way Michigan ran this thing, gave the money to the school district and said, yes, you can build a public library with this money as part of that new high school building. And so that went up in the early part of the 19th century. Now, Carnegie was asked by some of his robber baron buddies at one point, why are you doing this? This is crazy. Why are you investing in libraries? And he wrote an answer to this in a journal in 1888, and I'll just let you read this. It's an interesting period piece. So this thing at the end, this is not charity. This is not philanthropy. It is the people themselves helping themselves by taxing themselves. Now this is where I want to engage in a little trope, okay? And this is an important framing device for you to think about the role of the library in the University of Michigan and the role of libraries generally in the society. Libraries have, in one way or another, kind of signed on to the idea that they are cultural institutions. I think this is a really bad idea. It's not that it's not true, because they are cultural institutions. But the implications of accepting that designation are very dysfunctional, not only for libraries, but for society as a whole. Because as we've constructed the idea of cultural institutions in the United States, they are something that you are permitted to do because you've generated a large social surplus. A society that generates a large social surplus, a society that's rich, can afford to invest in cultural institutions because that's what successful societies do. They invest in cultural institutions. So if you work backward into the kind of production scheme here, hard work and know-how come together, generate wealth, and some of that wealth gets directed toward the support of cultural institutions. This is backwards. It makes more sense to think about it this way. Cultural institutions are the critical infrastructure that create the know-how that, together with hard work, generates the money. You understand the difference between those two? I spent some time at the Harvard Business School, and one of the really useful things I learned at the Harvard Business School is the following distinction. Are you on the revenue side of the house or on the expenditure side of the house? Those of you who've lived on both sides know which one is better. If you're on the side that makes the money, life is nicer. If you're just on the side that spends the money, it's harder. We are on the side that makes the money. We are not on the side that spends the money. But we like to talk about ourselves as being on the side that spends the money. Why? Why do we talk about ourselves that way? I'm not sure. But it's a deeply embedded cultural consciousness that somehow, money is bad. So a few years ago, when I was dean of SI, I went to a meeting of ALICE. Some of you might know about ALICE. It's the Association of Library and Information Science Educators, people who teach in library schools. And as dean of SI, I, sort of was obligated to go and carry our flag because we are a school that does that. And actually it was a really interesting experience for me because at one point I got, asked by my colleagues to be the head of the ALICE Deans and Directors group. And made a lot of friends and learned a lot of things about the sort of knowledge, the education side of the library world from these very intelligent, very committed people. At one of these meetings, there was a guy named Gorman, who was, he's written a lot about library education. He was, I see from the chuckles you're familiar with him. Anyway, there was a panel at an Elise meeting, and I don't even remember where it was. I think it was in Florida or someplace. And Gorman was on the panel, and at one point he gave this amazing speech, which was to the effect that libraries have to stay away from people who have been successful at making money. It's like, what? In Michigan, we like actually try to get to know those people, you know. So yeah, it's this, you know, it's a corrupting influence. And, you know, I thought, well, are we going to, like, have a rousing chorus of the Internationale here? I mean, you know, what is this kind of nonsense? It's a completely stupid thing to say. I mean, it's not the kind of thing I would think that an educated person would say. And, you know, look, I've read some of Gorman's stuff. I mean, this guy's not crazy, and he's well-intentioned, I know. But I mean, this cultural baggage tied to this cultural institution thing is very problematic for us. And it's very problematic for us right now because we're in a very funny situation.
Irresistibly, in response to that, I have to go off and talk to someone who pays money.
And we wish you Godspeed. So, we're a public university. And if you think about this concept of the Morrill Act and the land-grant institution, you end up with a model that looks something like this. So the state says, well, we're a pretty enlightened outfit, and we really need these knowledge communities because these knowledge communities generate our capability to create wealth. And in order to get that system running, we actually have to make deals, 2 separate deals simultaneously. So the core idea is that we want these young people to go to college so that they will become successful, and that will be a rising tide that lifts all ships, right? So one of the things that will come back to us is tax revenue, right, for the state. We'll have a successful economy that will support the commonweal, and in order to make that happen, we actually have to have a production system that does it. So we are going to create an institution, the University of Michigan is one example, there's a bunch of others in the state, to educate these young people. So the money is going to come from the consequences of that action over here, and we're going to use some of that surplus to pay for this thing called the University of Michigan. Now what that does is establish 2 separate agency relationships. There's a concept called agency theory. And then, you know, you have a principal who wants something done, and you have an agent who's going to do it for that person. And then the question is, what's the contract between them? And the problem that the principal has is, am I going to pay this agent to do this and not get what I want? And the problem the agent has is, am I going to do this for the principal and not get paid? Right? So this is sort of economics in a nutshell, right? Trying to figure out how that contracting works. So you got this odd bifurcated contracting structure where the contract between the state and the university is, we got a lot of people who need to be educated, we want you to do that education. And over here it's, we'd like you guys to get educated, and so we're going to make that real easy for you. We're going to artificially suppress the price of that. It is a private good as well as a public good. You will benefit from this, you'll have higher income, blah, blah, blah. But the activation energy for you is very high unless we lower that cost for you, so we're going to subsidize the production system so you don't have to pay as much. Now the really interesting question here is, what's the agency relationship between we and they? Now in public universities, this has been cloudy. In private universities, it's not. It's not, right? It's like, if you come here, you're going to pay a lot of money, and we're actually going to notice that, right? Whereas the tradition here is basically, we pretend to teach them, and they pretend to learn. Right? Now, along the way, actually, some real teaching and some real learning does happen, right? It's easy to be facetious about it. But when you think about the reinforcement of the agency contract between us, there's almost no agency contract. Now, I will say I came from another big public university, the University of California, and the attention to undergraduate education at Michigan is much higher than it is on most of the UC campuses. So there are local differences. I mean, you know, levels of commitment, traditions of the place, and so forth that moderate this relationship. But this relationship is really up for grabs right now. And the way it's showing up in public universities is that they have been receiving less direct state contribution, and therefore they've been raising tuition. And you know, students notice this. And they start thinking of themselves as our customers. And this gets us into a whole kind of completely warped ontological construct of student as customer, which nobody knows what to do with. It's a ridiculous idea. But you can see why it gains traction. And it raises lots of questions about the future of our institution. And these are the kinds of things that I want to talk about in the remaining part of this talk. I want to talk about how changing infrastructure has an enormous impact on how this agency relationship plays out in the future, because this is the heart of where public university is going, this agency relationship. This is, if we don't resolve this, we will not resolve that. We've been trying to work on that, and that's not working. This contract is being rewritten not on our terms. You may have noticed that over the last 5 years. The contract's being reinforced from the state in the form of, here, have less money. Every year, have less money. You know, they gave us a lot less money last year, and then they came and took $35 million of it back. You know about the rescissions. They'd already given us the money, and they said, send us a check for $35 million, and we did, because we have to, because it's the law, right? So, and I will tell you personally, this was grievous to me, because I was trying to get some of that $35 million, you know, for cool projects. Not there, right? That's the reality we're in. And you know the state of Michigan economy. This is not going to be an easy thing to get ourselves out of. I will say that, you know, California does lead the nation in a lot of things, and not only did we, you know, lead with Ward Connolly, we also led with term limits. Let's go back to the Landgrant College and University system and ask, what's the infrastructure that enabled that? The answer is it was the railroad. The railroad, which by the way is not just the railroad and the telegraph were contemporary, and they were complementary. So the telegraph lines accompanied the rail lines wherever they went, because you actually had to have the telegraph to manage the railroad. And now that you had the railroad there, it was really easy to build the telegraph. So the combination of the telegraph and the railroad shows something interesting. I did a little back of the envelope analysis. I just looked at when the railroad arrived in the rural town within which a Big Ten campus was created. These are the ones outside of the main urban areas, which were already served. And guess what? Michigan Central came to Ann Arbor in 1835. Campus located here in 1837. Pennsylvania Railroad got to State College, 1852, 1855. Penn State was created. Illinois Central got to Urbana-Champaign in 1851. 1867, UIUC was created. Chicago Lafayette and Cincinnati, 1886. Purdue was created in 1869. 1866, 1869. This is true of all of the major land-grant institutions that were created around the time of the Morrill Act. The railroad infrastructure was critical in two respects. Think about the nature of the production system. At that time, the society's not very mobile. The roads are garbage, right? The roads are not roads. They're virtually impassable during most of the year. And the thing that you got to use to go on them, which is a horse-drawn or animal-drawn vehicle, is an extremely crude device for traveling. So the idea of going 20 or 30 miles by road to someplace during most of the year is completely out of the question. It's going to take you all day to make that trip, maybe more than one day, depending on the condition of the roads. The railroad actually makes it possible to cover that kind of distance. The production system of higher education is one of a focal point to which all of the people who aspire to be members of the knowledge community come and reside. And this is how we think of college, right? This is what we think of as going away to college. You're living in some community, and you get accepted to college, and you uproot yourself from that community, and you move, using the transportation infrastructure, to that place, and you live there for most of a year, every year for a number of years, and that's how you go to college, right? So that concept of going away to college is deeply embedded in your consciousness, and that's because that infrastructure enables that mode of production. Now I want to switch gears here a little bit and go into a story about how changing infrastructure is changing access and agency right in our own era in ways that are going to be pretty profound for higher education and in which the library is going to play increasingly important roles. And I'm going to start by talking about communications infrastructure. I like this picture because it sort of captures it all. What do you think this is a picture of? Telephone operator, right? Most of us, sorry to say, are not so young that we look at that and say, what's that? We remember this, right? Even if we don't have a lot of personal experience with it. There were a whole bunch of these people. They were generally women who were employed at patching through telephone calls. This started when the telephone first got into production and the public switched exchanges grew up in the late 19th century. And what happened was when you picked up your telephone, it either had an automatic signaling device that signals the central office, as it was called, or you turned a crank, which generated a pulse, which rang the central office, and a light lit up on one of these boards, and somebody took a connector, a wire, and they plugged into the hole underneath your extension. It's the wire that ran out to your place, and they said operator or central, and or if it was a small town, hi John, it's Mary Beth, who do you want to talk to? And you would give them an extension number, and they would basically patch you through to that. Now, the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, which sort of had a monopoly on telephony in the United States, knew as early as the 1920s that this was an unsustainable model of production because they knew how to do time and motion studies, the scientific management movement that was well underway by that time. And so they had basically found out how much time does it take to patch through one of these calls. So if you know how much time it takes to patch through a call, and you know what the rising call volume is, which was very steep, the number of people making telephone calls was growing, and the number of calls they were making was growing very rapidly, they calculated that they would run out of labor to switch the phone calls within about 20 years. I mean, literally, we'll run out of labor. There'd be so many people switching the phone calls. Well, let's put it this way. The equilibrium point would be there would be so many people switching the phone calls that there's not enough to make the phone calls, right? And so they saw this coming, and it was an unsustainable thing. So they started automating the telephone system. Now, if you remember dial phones, you remember this, right? And what I want to point to here, two things. First of all, there's numbers and there's letters. And contrary to what you're thinking, this was not to enable SMS, right? This was because you switched from that old system where you were an extension from a central exchange to a new system where there was no operator at the end. And that's why this is the user interface in the center here. It says, wait for dial tone. That's your instruction. When you lift this up, there's no human at the other end. The replacement for the human is dial tone. Dial tone tells you you're in. You're in the network. And you now have to execute an address protocol, which requires you to dial a number. What number? Well, it'll be a number kind of like this. WA in capital letters, L-N-U-T, Walnut, which is the exchange because it was on Walnut Street, 3612. So before you would have said, hey, Mary Beth, give me Walnut 3612. Now you have to dial WA 3612. That's why the letters are here. So you dial 9-2-3612, and the call goes forward through the electromechanical switching system. Now that, of course, was brought forward, as was all of the telephony technology, into the touch tone system, the crossbar switching and so forth. And the letters came with it, and this is what enabled SMS. Right? So this is an important story about developing infrastructure. The old infrastructure was appropriated for new purposes in the form of SMS on cell phones, but it wasn't there for that reason. And while this automation of the phone system was going on, the AT&T company had to kind of bring the population along. And so they had this mantra that they would recite, which is, if not for the automation of the telephone system, most of the population would have to be telephone operators. This is why we're automating the system, so you don't have to become a telephone operator. Now, the important thing to understand is this is exactly backwards. The automation of the system was to make everybody into a telephone operator. Right? I mean, you understand how fundamental that shift in point of view is. That's what it was for, was to make everybody an operator. So before, you didn't have to be literate. You didn't have to know anything. You lift up the phone, hey, get me so-and-so, and it would happen. Now you not only have to be able to read the dial, you have to understand something about how it works. You have to become the operator of the system. It's the infrastructure pushing the ability to operate the system all the way down to the end user. So let's fast forward and ask this question about what does it mean to go away from college or go away to college? Nowadays, it doesn't mean anything. If you look at classrooms of days gone by and classrooms of today, there's actually a lot of similarities. That part of our production system has not changed dramatically yet. So it is true that people do physically come to the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, to Flint or Dearborn or whatever, and go to classes. But the people who are doing it, the students, are actually a successor species. They are not the people who came here 30 years ago. They don't leave their home communities to go away to college. They're connected to them 24/7 through communications and transportation infrastructure. They have automobiles. They have the internet and IRC and email. They have telephony, and they have access to relatively inexpensive and generally very low quality air transportation. But they're young and they don't know, right? They think this is how air transportation's always been. They think Northwest is actually pretty good. So President Bush asked, is our students learning? It's a very important question. But I would modify it in the following way. How is our students learning? How is that actually taking place? And the answer is through all kinds of mechanisms that we never came up with and we don't control. So this is my son. He's a student at Eastern. This is his Facebook site. And yes, he is one of my friends. This is part of his community. He actually goes to 3 universities simultaneously. He goes to Washtenaw, Eastern, and Michigan simultaneously. He doesn't actually think about where he's going to college. He's just going to college, sort of like you shop for food. Sometimes it's Coleman's or whatever they call it now. Sometimes it's Kroger. Doesn't really matter. One of these days he's going to have to get his rear end stamped, product of Mexico or whatever, from one of these institutions. But the production system to him, it's a smorgasbord, right? Did you know that as of 2005, 60% of all baccalaureate degrees granted in the United States were given to people who attended more than one institution of higher education in order to get that degree? And only 18% of all baccalaureate degrees granted were to people who went to residential institutions? That old idea that you went away to college, it's over. It's finished. It died. And we're now in a new era where college is sort of in the environment. And people are partaking of it as kind of in the environment. Now that doesn't mean, don't misunderstand, it doesn't mean that all of this deep investment in the infrastructure that we have here at the University of Michigan is going to go away, is going to lose importance, is going to be meaningless. No, that's going to carry on. There will always be the big house and everything. It'll, that's a very, very long-lasting thing. That people want to be involved in that. My point is that as a result of these changes, things like Facebook and MySpace, the blogging, blogging is growing incredibly fast. Things like YouTube, which I understand this thing's supposed to be on YouTube. All right? Enough said. It's educational. YouTube is growing, of course, phenomenally. Second Life, you see a lot of talk about stuff going on in Second Life. Joystick is another one of these places. And then don't forget the content side. This is just a set of images that comes up if you use Google Images and put digital library in quotes in as the search. These are pictures that you get up. These are all institutions who claim to be doing stuff in digital libraries. We all know about the center of that circle, the Google Library project. It's actually a pretty phenomenal thing, moving forward at breakneck speed. We're proud to be out on the lead on that. We look at JSTOR, born and raised here, sort of helped pave the way for this concept. Wikipedia, one that we can't claim any credit for. It didn't start with us. Britannica says the articles are garbage. Well, even if they are, there's a lot of them. As every faculty member knows, if you have enough quantity, it really does take care of the quality question. These are the traditional mechanisms for publication. This is in CARTA. This is the Wikipedia line, and this is just up through 2005. Somebody told me the other day that they crossed 2 million. Everybody says, the quality's no good, but, Nature ran this little analysis, and they compared articles head to head. Now, there's an interesting story here, which I want to kind of focus on for a moment. And this is a story about why Britannica is so doomed. And it's a general notion about the way in which knowledge communities form and how they function nowadays. You can't compare Wikipedia and Britannica unless you have a topic that they both have, right? So we have 1.9 million of Wikipedia's articles can't be used because, and they might all be garbage, because Britannica doesn't have them. Britannica has tens of thousands of articles, not millions, right? So when you compare the Britannica article to the Wikipedia article, comparing apples to apples, and you find that there's actually pretty good content in the Wikipedia side, the answer is very simple. The people who were putting that content into Wikipedia jacked it from Britannica, right? It's called mashup, all right? You're appropriating stuff. Now if you're a hardcore anti-plagiarist, it's like outrageous that you stole all of that from Britannica and put it in Wikipedia without citing Britannica, as though citing Britannica would take care of the problem. What I'm talking about here is, to the user, the source is actually kind of immaterial. The really interesting question is this good enough, right? Is this good enough for me to use? And incidentally, I talked to my 2 kids about this, both of whom were in college. I asked them, when you're looking for information on the internet, do you actually care about the quality of the information you get? And of course, the cartoon version would be, quality, what's that? Right? No, of course we don't look at quality. We're college students. We never think of such things. Right? We use the worst garbage we can find. The worse, the better. And we use that in our papers. Right? No, that's not what they say. They say, well, yeah, of course. Well, how do you look for quality? Well, we compare the sources. We look at who wrote it, We ask, is there a vested interest in this? We try to look at the backstory. It's like, you do? You like do those things that they taught me to do in college? You actually do those today? Yeah. What? All right. So all the doom and gloom doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Of course, a lot of stuff is moving into webcasting of various kinds. This is a YouTube thing. Podcasting. There's a lot of e-learning going on. There's a lot of open courseware initiatives underway. The MIT Open Courseware Initiative has had a huge impact in the world. It's sort of put up all the courses online and people can use them. Sky Project, born of our enterprise here in Michigan, is now present in about 100 countries around the world, spreading very fast. So we're back to this infrastructure access and agency, and I want to kind of close out on this idea. What we're seeing here is a change in the infrastructure of communication and content sharing, which is altering access. And in the process, it's altering agency. So students, for example, what we used to think of as a college student that would go away to college, they're not going away to college. College is just something that happens in the space they are in the world. Some of it's physical, some of it's virtual, some of it moves back and forth between these things. And they're actually very adept, because these are all people, by the way, who were born after the Macintosh ad ran. Right? Remember the Macintosh 1984 Olympics ad? Right, or Super Bowl. It was the Super Bowl ad. More important. You know, that these are all people who were born after that ad. To me that ad happened yesterday, but these were people who were born after that. So these people, they didn't grow up where the question, where can I find a phone, holds any meaning. I need to find a phone. It's like, dude, in your pocket, right? That's their world. They're immersed in this stuff. They get what's going on here. It doesn't matter whether we do or not. They're on it. Well, actually, it does matter whether we do or not, because the opportunity that's generated by this is really tremendous. So I want to just close off with a few observations. This is a great quote from Lord Acton, who gave us absolute power, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, this was a comment he made actually about the Church of England, which I think was prescient. As a general rule, institutions fail because of overzealous adherence to their own first principles. We can see this happening right now in the recording industry, right? Which their first principle was to make a lot of money by controlling the medium. Well, now they can't control the medium, and they don't know what to do, right? They've lost the medium. They can't control the rents because they can't control the medium. So here's some first principles. These are actually taken from the ALA. You look down that list: access, collaboration, diversity, education, intellectual freedom, preservation, privacy, professionalism, public good, service. They're all great things. I don't have any gripes with any of them. But it's not clear to me that it's a comprehensive list. So, for example, here's another set of first principles I just came up with for the hell of it. Those all seem to be pretty good too, right? So why get fixated on the list of first principles that we've been using for a long time? Why not say that, it's a long list? Maybe in some cases we're going to find out that among these first principles there's some contradictions that really raise difficult questions for us that we have to cope with. Let's go back to Andrew Carnegie 120 years ago. We actually have made a lot of progress. In the United States, literacy, which was about 90%, there's lots of ways to measure literacy, and we can have that fight, but it was around 90% in 1900. It's now around 99% for whites. Of course, the big rise was in people of color, right? It's where it rose from 53% to about 98%. Now, people, can quibble with whether we really have achieved 99% or 98% literacy. But there's no question that there's a huge difference between the literacy now and the literacy then. Or just coming back to higher education alone. In 1900, 2% of the population went to college. Today, about 25% of the population graduates from college. So these have made big changes. So these things we've done. But lest we forget what Carnegie was thinking, it's sometimes useful to say, hey, we won, right? We went out to do these things and we did them. It's time to stop thinking that's the objective. The objectives are different objectives now. Now, that doesn't mean that those objectives have gone away. So, for one thing, there are more illiterate people on Earth today than there were people on Earth at Andrew Carnegie's time. Now, you could say, yeah, that's the danger of runaway population growth. Well, I'm simply saying that in terms of absolute numbers of people that we still need to get to about literacy, that challenge is as big as it ever was, right? So we're not done by any means. Somewhere between the 1 and 2 billion people are poverty-stricken, 2 to 3 billion live without political freedom. These are all things that are tied together in that list of first principles. But the age of enterprise continues. And this is sort of the hopeful story here. There are about 1 billion people with internet access. That number is going to be a lot larger in a few years. But more importantly, and much more quickly growing, are the people with cell phone access. That number is now 2 to 3 billion, and it's probably going to be about 75% of the population fairly soon. The ability to use these communication devices, these changes in infrastructure, to alter access and agency is just stunning. So that's actually the end of the talk. And if you want to talk for a few minutes about competencies, I'm happy to do that. But the sort of core notion here is that we're living in a really amazing time, a time in which a lot of the old bets are off. Things are really up for grabs. And this is moving a lot more quickly than many of us realize. And all you have to do is talk to young people about this. For example, have a talk with a young person about the nature of intellectual property. It's not that they don't know. It's not that they have been looking at these things that we send out from my office. I am, by the way, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act agent for the university, so I have a nice up-close and personal relationship with the RIAA. It's not like they get these takedown notices and so forth, and they say, gee, what is this? You know, what is this? Why are people so mad at me? That's not what they say. They say, oh, I better plug that hole, right? They don't think of downloading music as unlawful, even if they've been told that, right? They have a different way of thinking about this kind of stuff. Now, it's part of our responsibility to try to move that in a positive direction. I actually don't think it's a good thing to raise a generation of people who hold the law in contempt. That's actually bad for the society when you think about it, right? Because the rule of law turns out to be one of the pluses of the last 300 years in human evolution. So you don't want that happening. But the way that the RIA is going about trying to get people respectful of the law isn't working. We actually have to think differently. Plagiarism is another good example. We crossed the Rubicon on this some time ago. We don't penalize people for plagiarism. We grade the quality of their plagiarism. Right? This is what we have been doing for some time. And the best plagiarizers get the best grades. Right? And the reason is we don't know they're plagiarizing. Right? So that's the beauty of plagiarism. Right? Is to plagiarize like hell but not have anybody notice. Right? Well, what does that mean? Now, a lot of students are engaged in worlds where something called like a mashup, which is really a form of sort of sophisticated plagiarism, is considered to be a very good thing. It's a new kind of creativity. And when you think about the knowledge community issue, almost all knowledge is reuse. Right? The vast majority of what you learn in school is not original. Like, you have to write an original paper. Come on, have you read any papers that are written by people in school? You teach for a while and you realize, no. We have doctoral education. That actually prepares people to try to do one thing, the dissertation, that's original. And students find out, you know, that's harder than it looks. Come up with something that people haven't thought of before, it's not easy. But the idea that we would have mechanisms that would make it possible for very large numbers of people in the world to engage in this process of knowledge reuse, that's interesting. And that kind of infrastructure is now there for us. So, leave you a final thought. How many people are learning at the University of Michigan? If I ask Provost Sullivan that question, a very smart person, she'll probably know it's a trick question coming from me. But, you know, if she gave a canonical answer, she'd say, let's see, who's paying? Right? 40,000. Round numbers, 39.5. Are paying customers in our store, right? You think that's the number of people who are learning as a result of the University of Michigan's presence in the world? I think it's off by several zeros on the end. My guess is that at minimum, the number of people who are learning at any given time at the University of Michigan is in the hundreds of thousands because of our presence in the world and because of access people have to what we're doing. We're not counting them. We don't even know they're there. The library plays a huge role in this. This Google thing is going to be much bigger, right? We don't even know that we're already doing it, much less how to do it, how to really leverage that. That, I think, is the exciting opportunity going forward. And that's what I think competencies in librarianship are really going to be focused on over the next decade. That's the high-value proposition for the library world. We need the library world more than almost anybody else outside that library world realizes. It's a real core piece of our capability. So with that, have some questions? Yeah.
I guess my concern is when you talk about infrastructure and you go through that history, the infrastructure seemed to always be set up for the upper class. And the infrastructure in the digital realm is still following that same kind of model. And that trickle down, even though when you talk about the digital divide has closed for poor people and people of color, the infrastructure part of the digital divide is still there. When you talk to people in the inner city, they're still talking dial-up and things like that. The other part that concerns me is the fact that the digital content is expanding at this enormous rate. But the content focused at people of color and communities of color and poor people is not expanding at all. It's stagnant or not growing. So I'm wondering how all of this magnificent stuff is going to help the lower levels of our society.
Yeah. Okay, well, this is actually one place where the traditions of librarianship have a fairly glorious history. One of the things that was really impressive to me when I became Dean of the School of Information was going back and looking at some of our alums and what they had accomplished. And one of the common signatures in graduates from the library program at Michigan, which opened in 1926, was that a lot of these people were very courageous and actually put their careers and in some cases probably their personal safety on the line around issues like anti-discrimination and so forth. So I think one of the things that's a really abiding notion of librarianship is that you want to bet on the side of giving people access to information, access to knowledge, and presuming that it'll work out well. And of course, this is where people who are pretty sophisticated but are bigoted try to intervene because they're worried about that. That's why they didn't want to teach slaves to read. Right? So there's no way that I can think of that we're going to end up with a general and universal solution to these class distinctions, racial distinctions, and so forth in our society. I mean, they've proved to be amazingly tenacious. And that's part of a consequence of our great sin of slavery, but it's also partly just the nature of human behavior. People are ethnocentric and so forth. So that's a hugely difficult nut to crack. And none of what I'm talking about here takes anything away from that fact, because I share the concerns that you have. But it also shouldn't be taken to mean that we want to give up on that. So I think, this is my notion about how librarianship helps. In the library world, you don't have to attack that head on, but you can have a big influence on it behind the scenes. So the idea that we make available resources, generally, that would otherwise be restricted to the elite, is a huge step in empowering people who are less advantaged. Now, it doesn't take it the rest of the way, so I'll tell you what the real problem is with access to the digital content world. It's not the technology. It's not the dial-up versus broadband. That will be fixed, and it'll be fixed on the back of the entertainment structure, the way it is right now. All of this broadband internet is carried by the entertainment world, right? And by the way, remember, Tredescan's Rarities was an entertainment. So the relationship between entertainment and learning is very, very deep, and it's very important. So that sort of narrow channel issue, how we're going to get broadband into the hands of the less served population, will be resolved. They will have the disadvantage of having it resolved later rather than earlier. The much harder nut to crack is the non-technical infrastructure. Where do they get help in learning how to put this to value, how to make this of greatest advantage? And so just going back to my SI days, one of the really creepy things of living in California for the last 30 years had been the sort of systematic defunding of school libraries. There are lots of reasons why that happened in the state of California, but California's elementary schools, now only about 5% of them have school librarians. My students and I did an interesting study of which elementary schools in the wealthy district of Irvine Unified School District, where I was at UCI, we did the study of which elementary schools had the most aggressive use of IT. This was in the mid-90s, so it was fairly early, and the web was pretty early, and so forth. It was a very interesting result. The schools that were farthest ahead had a partnership between two people in the school, and without that partnership, there was no progress. The two people were the school librarian and the custodian. School librarian knew something about the role that information plays in learning, and the custodian knew how to maintain infrastructure. And if the custodian and the school librarian were friends, and they sort of got on this thing, those schools were way ahead of the other schools. Where does that kind of social human knowledge infrastructure get into the inner city, get into the underserved areas? That's the really dangerous part of this. That's the thing that's going to slow it down more than anything else. I mean, by the way, did you know there are still 13 areas in Michigan that do not have and have never had wireline telephone service? Ever. They were so sparsely populated, they lived outside of the universal service provision of the 1934 Telecommunications Act, right? Now that's hardcore, right? And by the way, most of those are not people of color. They're very poor white people. We got a lot of problems with this in the society, and I'm 100% behind you. But I think this is a place where the inside of the library world, which is make it possible, enable it, facilitate its use, take it as far as you can on that front. Because in a lot of cases, you don't have agency to take it a lot farther. That's not what you're funded for. But you can accomplish an awful lot just by laying the capability in place and then helping other things to pick up. So it's the most positive answer I can give you. But it's inadequate, given the magnitude of the crime, in my view. Other questions? Yes?
So, given that it's pretty evident that the state is not particularly interested in funding the infrastructure for the top tier already paying part of the freight personnel at the university, how do we fund the extension of access to people who don't know who they are, they're not really paying their way?
Yeah. Okay, so this is where my story about cultural institutions comes in. We got to get the state to be wanting to pay. That's the challenge. They're benighted. They need to be enlightened, and we need to enlighten them. The idea that they're going to come to this on their own is a bit of a stretch, right? They don't see it. But what do they see right now? What's the political hot button right now? The state's economy is suffering. And there's not going to be a turnaround in the economy. We can't go back. We can only go forward to something new. This economy cannot recover, because that would mean returning to something that it used to be. It can't be that thing anymore. It's the end of the dominance of high-paying industrial jobs that the state is facing, and it's never coming back. And I think it's slowly dawning on people in the leadership of the state that it's a little bit like a cargo cult to be going after that, making a model of an airplane and then sitting and waiting for cargo to fall from the sky, right? I mean, it's not going to work. So we've got to actually demonstrate what's possible, and then we've got to take it back to them and say, you need to help. This is in the interest of the state, in the interest of your political future to help do this. And I think that's feasible. But it requires a change in attitude, and you guys are not the heart of the problem here. It's the faculty that are the heart of the problem, right? I will be willing to bet you that most of the faculty at the University of Michigan come out from outside of the University of Michigan, right? We source our faculty typically from outside our institutions, many from outside the state. I would be willing to bet you that the vast majority of our faculty can give you a very detailed description of the state of Michigan from the perspective of Interstate 94 between Ann Arbor and DTW. They really know that stretch of road. But they couldn't tell you anything about the state of Michigan beyond that. And in fact, a lot of faculty, this is not too harsh a way to say it, are extremely disappointed that the University of Michigan is in Michigan. Right? That's its biggest single drawback. Well, we can't remain a great institution and have that attitude on the part of many of our faculty persist. It's just, it doesn't even correspond to the opportunity that we have, much less deal with the threats we're under. So to put it simply, what I'm proposing is even harder than it looks. We can't just go it alone. We need the state. Let me just put it to you this way. If you look back over the state of Michigan's contribution to the Michigan over the years, the University of Michigan, yeah, it's true that it's a declining percentage of our total run rate, but it's still over $300 million a year. And all of that money is completely discretionary. It comes with no strings attached because of constitutional autonomy. The state of Michigan has always been and remains the University of Michigan's largest venture capitalist. If we lose that, we cannot remain where we are. It won't be feasible. We've got to get the state to realize that it's in the interest of the state to give us more money. And the way we do that is demonstrating what our value proposition to them really is. And that means we're going to have to reach out beyond our borders. We're going to have to start working with the interests of the state in doing this. And it's starting to happen. It's not a downside story. This is an upside story. And it is beginning to happen. I've actually been surprised in discussions I've had with the leadership of the faculty as well as the administration that this is starting to catch on. The library, by the way, also will play a huge role in this. So, I mean, Paul Courant and I work quite closely together. We're good friends. He was provost when I was dean and so forth. Paul and I have the notion that the library is now and in this position to become even more so, and more obviously so, the central piece of this transformation of not just higher education, but education. We think that's necessary. So this is the kind of discussion that I think we want to keep having. I mean, obviously, it's not going to happen by Paul or me saying, yeah, this is what, let's go do this. It's much harder than that. It requires a social movement. But that's what we're trying to get going. Yeah, last question.
So to ask you a philosophical question, Luther's innovation was every man a priest, but leaders of faith communities didn't go away. Their role transformed.
Right.
Mediation of access to the divine to more roles as counselors, guidance therapists, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
AT&T's innovation, on the other hand, was somewhat similar, whether they knew it or not. Everybody a telephone operator, but telephone operators didn't become guides for telephone users, they went extinct. Would you say that the growth of the internet and easy access to digital information is making every information seeker a librarian? And if so, are we going in the Protestant direction or the outright direction?
Okay, so that's the question. That is the question. No, you can put your finger right on it. And the answer to that question is it depends on librarians. So my view is that the world we're entering into is one in which the core concept of literacy must entail and incorporate things that we now think of as librarianship. Let me just take a simple example. My hard disk. It's a curse that disk technology is progressing so quickly. Because I now have images of former hard disks on my current hard disk containing tons and tons of stuff, some of which I'm sure is valuable. I never look inside it because I know what I would see. It would be like, one of these, it'd be like mining, right? 150 million tons of ore to get like an ounce of gold. And I'm not willing to do the refining, right? So this whole idea of how you organize information, how you enable yourself to get at information, how to discriminate the quality of information, these are all things that are now moving into the job of the individual. They used to be mediated. So then you ask, well, saying, what's the job of the librarian? Well, the job of the librarian is to try to help build the apparatus that makes that possible. So you say, everybody has to, quote, learn how to be a librarian. How? How's that going to happen? I don't, one thing I learned in the library world when I was dean of SI was kind of a shocking thing to me, but it was sensible after I discovered it. Librarianship isn't like chemistry. It's not a world of work in which there's a large corpus of epistemic information, explicit information in the form of books or journals. It's more like surgery. It's a deeply knowledgeable craft world in which there's understanding how things work is at the heart of it. And yeah, people publish stuff and, but I was amazed the first time when Brenda or somebody in the library came and said, we want to do something about the LIS collection, right, which was sort of sequestered in its own little place. We want to move it into the general stacks. I said, well, that sounds good. Let me go look at it. I walk in, it's like, what? It's like the size of a postage stamp. There isn't much literature in LIS, which is kind of weird for a field that's all about literature. That's because the knowledge is deeply tacit. It's in the production system. And by the way, universities are very bad, as a general rule, at dealing with that kind of knowledge, which I think is part of the reason why librarianship has had kind of a hard time getting traction as a field of academic study. It really belongs much more in the professional side of things. But that's something that, as far as I can tell, the literature in the LIS community hasn't come to grips with very well. Well, this idea of how you get that kind of deep tacit knowledge imparted to people is a big deal. Is it going to be the kind of deep capacity of the story of the Reformation, or is it going to be the sort of superficial, yeah, I know how to do keystrokes with my thumb and SMS? That's a key question. If it's only the latter, it's a huge opportunity loss. It's the former where the big story lies. So with that, thanks very much. I really appreciate your inviting me.